Hi everyone, my name is Tiff, and Pablo and I are excited to inform you about the Luddite movement. Let us begin with contextualization. The Luddite movement occurred from 1811 to 1816, particularly in the United Kingdom. It was during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. The reason this historical period is so crucial is because it reflects a key shift in how goods were being produced and how organizing labor operated. Before industrial progressions occurred, textile production, for example, was often decentralized and accomplished by skilled artisans like weavers and croppers. These workers often worked in more localized environments with much more control over their work wages and conditions of labor. Later, factories rose, making production much more centralized and eventually introduced new machines such as mechanized looms and knitting frames. The Luddite movement was also often focused in major textile producing areas like Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, and Lancashire. Workers were most directly impacted by industrialization in these regions, making these regions very tense environments. The primary goal of the Luddite movement was to advocate for skilled workers in their conditions with these quick industrial changes occurring. Although members of the movement were perceived as being anti-technology, this is actually a common misconception they are known for. They weren't necessarily anti-technology alone, but were more so against the ways factory owners utilize those machines to shorten their wages, replace their roles, and have higher profits while harming their working conditions. Therefore, the goals of the movement also included advocating for equitable wages, prioritizing skilled labor, and demanding better work conditions. They also protested for government intervention for more tangible changes, but the government often supported factory owners. This led to organized forms of protests, and protesters are most remembered for machine breaking. To elaborate, their nighttime raids included the destruction of machines that were harming their working conditions and livelihoods. These protests were thoughtful and strategic, revealing the limitations workers experienced since laws limited their capacity to organize through unions. All in all, the Luddite movement is remembered as a symbol of working class struggle and solidarity, especially resisting industrial capitalism. Workers rebelled against both technology and social and economic shifts that harmed them through the Industrial Revolution. Moving forward, I will primarily zoom in on these particular questions. How are the main protest events mobilized? What strategies were used to mobilize? First, I want to discuss the main strategies of the Luddites. The movement was mobilized through very intentional and thought out initiatives of direct action, although it was often perceived as irrational violence. The main strategy was to break machines during organized nighttime raids towards workshops and factories. These targets aimed for particular machines like knitting frames and mechanized looms as they especially exploited laborers. Therefore, these forms of resistance were not just responses to changes of technology, but were thought out initiatives to demand better and fair wages and equitable working conditions. Historians like Eric Hobsbawm claim that machine breaking was often a form of collective action in times where negotiating these conditions were not allowed. There were also political conflicts that impacted the Luddite movement, and in this historical climate, working class men were not often fairly represented in the beginning of the 19th century. Acts like the Combination Acts of 1799 often limited trade unions, making it unlawful for workers to organize and resist together. This is why laborers often use direct action as the most reliable form of protest, as these disruptive forms of resistance demanded a call to action, especially when negotiating with institutions was not accessible. Next, I will turn to the constraints of the movement and elaborate further on the shift to direct action. So, the Luddites often relied on disrupted protests, mainly because of both legal and political limitations. In the early 1800s, laws like the Combination Acts greatly limited laborers' ability to organize, especially restricting them from forming work and trade unions or bargaining collectively. Since institutional negotiation was not a viable option, laborers often shifted to more direct and urgent forms of resistance. Building off of frameworks from Charles Tilley and Sidney Terrell, this specific pivot can be interpreted as a change towards contentious politics, where marginalized communities leverage urgent strategies when more traditional forms of resistance are not viable. Breaking machines was a key example of how strategies and urgency are crucial when people experience political limitations. And while it was not necessarily the most desirable option, it was the most tangible. While the Luddite movement is typically perceived as decentralized, it actually revealed key forms of coordination and collective efforts. Laborers created networks across areas like Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, further encouraging them to coordinate efforts and initiatives thoughtfully. There was a key and historically symbolic figure known as Ned Ludd who worked to bring protesters towards a shared goal and identity, even if there was not a specific leader who led the movement. This connects to Mancur Olson's argument claiming how collective action means involving similar goals and thoughtful efforts to be effective. The Luddite movement was able to build solidarity across different regions, which reveals how their efforts were thoughtful and intentional rather than irrational or sporadic. Outside of these tactics and collective efforts, these forms of protest that the Luddite movement used were also grounded in key moral frameworks. To elaborate, E.P. Thompson describes this as a moral economy where laborers believed the right to advocate for equitable wages and a fair working environment and conditions. Industrial capitalism often exploited and compromised these values, leading to machine breaking as it reflected the urge for community justice and economic equitability. Destroying these machines was a material tactic, but also reflected the Luddites' resistance to harmful working standards. Ultimately, these protests were strategic and tactical, but also grounded in ethical beliefs and community values. We will now shift to Pablo to discuss the relationship between the Luddite movement and the state, particularly as it relates to the repression of the protests.
So far, we have examined the mobilization factors and strategies behind the Luddite movement. However, since protests tend to be targeted at those in power, we may wonder what the subsequent reaction of the state was, and more broadly, what relations the Luddites entertained with the state. As argued by E.P. Thompson, that relationship was complex and evolved throughout the movement. As he explains, the start of the violence in 1811 corresponded with the collapse of an ideal, that of a benevolent and paternalist state that could protect the workers. A notable example was the 1809 Act that authorized the hiring of non-apprentice weavers, who could replace the skilled artisans thanks to mechanization. Despite this shift away from protecting artisans in a time of crisis, there were still some voices within the state apparatus arguing for concessions to the Luddites. Most notably, Lord Byron's speech on the 27th of February 1812 in the House of Lords called for limitations on mechanization and for good faith attempts to negotiate with the Luddites, whose claims he viewed as legitimate. However, he was in the minority. In that parliamentary debate, the Earl of Liverpool, who was the main proponent of the Frame-Breaking Act, argued that negotiation risked further fueling the disturbances, and that, instead, the Luddites' methods had to be targeted. This confrontation exemplifies the recurrent debate within the authorities between repression and concessions, which is at the center of the relationship between public authorities and protesters. The evidence provided by Rassler in her study of the Iranian Revolution suggests that the concession strategy of Lord Byron can be particularly risky, since signaling opportunity can increase expectations and facilitate diffusion. As Luddite activity intensified and spread throughout the Midlands, the repression strategy of the British state began to take form. Consistently with the Earl of Liverpool's claims that the Luddite problem was one of insufficient deterrence, the 1812 Frame-Breaking Act increased punishment for destroying machines and participating in nighttime raids from imprisonment or transportation to capital punishment. This logic echoes the formula proposed by Tilley and Goldstone, which suggests that, all else equal, increasing the cost of participation can help deter protests by reducing incentives at the individual level. In addition to the new law, approximately 12,000 troops were sent to the region, more than were fighting in the Iberian Peninsula at the time. Large public executions were also organized to punish the participants, with 18 Luddites being sentenced to death in the York trials in early 1813. Luddite activity in the region saw a sharp decline after 1813, suggesting that the repressive strategy was effective, at least in the short term. This is consistent with Rassler's findings, not only because short-term deterrence of protests was achieved, but also because the unambiguous response of the government prevented the inconsistency that fueled collective action in the Iranian case. By refusing to offer concessions to the weavers, the government signaled that continued machine breaking would only be met with further repression. A key factor in understanding state repression of the Luddite movement is that Britain was arguably a proto-democratic country, with separation of powers and political freedoms limited to the elites. As a result, much of the repression took the form of legislative and judicial proceedings. As described by Poitras, in addition to the passing of the Frame-Breaking Act, mass trials were organized in Chester, Lancaster, and York in late 1812 and early 1813. However, these were far from impartial, since the penal code was modified in a way that allowed harsh penalties, including death, to be applied more broadly. Furthermore, Home Secretary Lord Sidmouth intervened to make sure uncompromising magistrates were appointed to the various trials, so that little leniency would be granted. Such strategies, in which democratic states used law to repress protest movements, is discussed at length by Salmini and Di Ronco. In their study, they argue that criminalization, by modifying sentences or creating new crimes, serves to delegitimize protesters as threats to the public order, while providing justification for state violence. This institutionalization of repression ensures that the response of the state is not only physical, but also moral. Moreover, legal strategies of this sort can further deter protests by making the costs incurred by participants more predictable and by setting a clear example. Indeed, as per Poitras, no major riots followed the 18 executions in New York, and the government was subsequently able to commute the sentences of many others, having set a strong deterrent example. To evaluate the overall success of the repression strategy adopted by the British state, long-term trends should also be examined. As a result of the consistent persecution of Luddites in the Midlands through both physical and legal means, attacks on mills rapidly declined, with most historians agreeing that it was fully suppressed by 1870. However, this did not mark the end of the machine-breaking tradition in the English labor movement, raising the question of diffusion. As described by Griffin, just over a decade after the suppression of the Luddite movement, the swing protests erupted in East Kent, largely inspired by earlier developments in the north. While these protests were led by farmers, they followed similar methods and strategies, organized in a decentralized manner and leading night raids to destroy machines. It is quite telling that these farmers had their own mythological inspiration in the figure of Captain Swing, which may have been inspired by King Lud. The diffusion and prevalence of machine breaking once again echoes similar findings in the literature. Pan and Siegel analyzed Saudi Arabian descent, a comparable context in the scale and intensity of repression. In their study, they show that repression can be directly effective, but indirectly mobilize supporters of the initial dissenters. Similarly, while the violence perpetrated in the Midlands may have served as an effective deterrent, it may also have fueled a broader labor movement of skilled artisans and workers, as well as the adoption of particular protest means. This is also consistent with Rasler's analysis, which highlights the diffusion effects that perceptions of illegitimate repression can produce. In conclusion, our presentation has shown, first, that the main protest events of the Luddite movement were mobilized through concrete and strategic means: direct action, nighttime raids, machine breaking, local networks, and a shared moral framework that turned individual grievances into collective resistance. Second, the Luddites' relationship with the state was ultimately defined by repression. The British government responded through military deployment and, crucially, legal and judicial means, and this strategy appears to have been effective in suppressing the movement in the short term. At the same time, both the historical record and political science theory suggest that such repression could not fully eliminate the broader grievances and protest repertories that later resurfaced in other protest movements. Thank you very much.